Hello, everybody. Welcome to Journey Through the Past. I'm John Horrigan. Thanks so much for joining me. Today's presentation is being brought to you by the Wellesley Council on Aging. Hello. And to all of you watching on Wellesley Public Media, thank you so much for joining me. Now, the views and opinions expressed are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Wellesley Council on Aging or Wellesley Public Media. Any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. When I use the term Indian, I do not mean to use it in a derogatory sense. Native Americans, Indigenous people, First Nation tribes are all interchangeable appellations. This is a text-driven presentation for the benefit of folks who may have difficulty hearing, or if you're a poor listener like myself. Any technical issues are on my side, and maybe one day I'll be able to make a presentation to you in person at the COA. But until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay strong. Now, I was a host, writer, and winner of 5 Boston New England Emmy Awards for my role on The Folklorist. You can find it at our YouTube portal at www.folklorist.tv. And I was blessed enough to receive 20 Boston New England Emmy Award nominations, 13 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and I was part of the back-to-back national champion in arts and entertainment with the Alliance for Community Media with the team at New TV in Newton, Mass. The show ran from 2011 to 2016. So our show today is The Pilgrims, 400 years after. We're going to talk about Puritans and separatists, exploration and exploitation, the Mayflower, the Great Dying, women on the Mayflower, the 5 landings, Patuxet, hardship and desperation, Squanto, Samoset, and Massasoit. First of all, you're going to hear me talk about 2 different dates. You may not know this, but there are 2 dates, Old Style and New Style. The Old Style was the Julian calendar, which was seasonal based on the seasons. And Great Britain and the 13 colonies of the United States moved from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, which was based around holidays in September of 1752. Pope Gregory XIII in 1582 wanted to align the new calendar with Christmas. So in order to make the jump, they had to skip 11 days. So September 2nd, 1752 was followed by September 14th, 1752. New Year's Day was moved from March 25th to January 1st. There were no Give Us Our 11 Days riots as Hogarth depicted in this painting in 1755, but it is an interesting painting. So folklore tells the tale that one Englishman hedged fellow villagers that he could dance for 12 days and nights without stopping. He began on the night of February 2nd, 1752, and danced through the night. The following day, though, was February 14th, and he collected on his bets. A Puritan believed that it was necessary to go back to the absolute beginning of Christianity before the church had been corrupted. The only truths were in the Old and New Testament. If it wasn't in the Bible, it was a man-made distortion of what God intended. Even hymns were a corruption of God's word. Now, they believed that a congregation began with a covenant between a group of believers and God. Because the identity of saints had already been determined by God, there was nothing a person could do to win salvation. Matthew 18:20, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Now, Puritans were English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries who sought to purify the Church of England of Roman Catholic practices, maintaining that the Church of England had not been fully reformed and should become more Protestant. And since the coronation of King James I, depicted on the right, in 1603, the pressure to conform to the Church of England was mounting. The king thought all Puritans were troublemakers and a threat to his power, and he exclaimed that he would, quote, harry them out of the land. Now, the separatists were Puritans who had determined that the Church of England was not a true Church of Christ. In 1607, when the Bishop of York found out about the separatist gatherings, some were imprisoned while others were being watched. Even though the king wanted them out of England, a person would need official permission to voyage to the European continent. So if they were to sail for Holland, where they felt they could worship as they wished, they would have to do it in secret. Now, William Bradford grew up in Austerfield in northern Nottinghamshire, and I start off with him because I traced my lineage on my father's side, and he is my great, 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 great grandfather. Hey, Pops. So he attended religious services in a nearby village called Scrooby. And it was here that he met the town's postmaster, William Brewster. And also he met the preacher, and he was a very eloquent speaker, John Robinson. They were separatists. The separatists' escape from England did not go well, as the first captain that they hired to take them to Holland turned out to be a traitor and a thief who turned them over to the authorities in the Lincolnshire town of Boston. After several months, they were released from prison and planned yet another escape, securing the services of a trustworthy Dutch captain. Unfortunately, the local militia pursued them to their departure point, which was Grimsby, and the men hastily sailed, literally leaving the women and children on the dock. But fortunately, they would rejoin their husbands a few months later in Holland. As they were now considered political dissidents in Holland, they were unprepared for the harsh reality that they would become social outcasts in a foreign country. That's Leiden. And that's where John Robinson took the congregation to. They faced limited persecution in Leiden. So William Bradford, after selling his estate in Austerfield, settled into Leiden as a fustian, or a corduroy worker, and he married Dorothy May in 1613. They had a son named John in the year 1617, whom they would leave behind, and this certainly contributed to Dorothy's depression while she was on board the Mayflower. William Bradford, after selling his estate in Austerfield, settled into Leiden as a fustian or corduroy worker, and he married Dorothy May in 1613. They had a son named John in 1617, and they left him behind when they went to the New World. They left him in Holland, and this might have contributed to Dorothy's depression while she was on board the Mayflower. I think of that, a mother parted from a newborn, forced to sail 3,000 miles across a rough ocean, and she only had one small chest of clothing for herself and her husband and their children. Tough life. Now, William Brewster drew the ire of the English when he published, with the assistance of a 23-year-old named Edward Winslow, a separatist pamphlet that was critical of the king and his Church of England. He went into hiding as James had put out a bounty on his head. Now, early in the 17th century, England realized that its future prosperity relied on the colonization of North America, as Spain, France, and Holland were reaping profits from the fish and fur trade. These European kingdoms had highly developed military, naval, governmental, and entrepreneurial capabilities, and the Spanish and Portuguese centuries-old experience of conquest and colonization during the Reconquista, coupled with new oceanic ship navigation skills, provided the tools, ability, and desire to colonize the New World. The English were behind. So that's why in 1606, King James chartered the Virginia Company with the backing of wealthy merchants in London and Plymouth, England. Now, after attempts to found a colony in modern-day Maine failed, it was called the Popham Colony, and Jamestown wasn't returning the wealth that they had anticipated, the king resolved to franchise future settlements by issuing particular patents to those who wished to begin plantations in the New World. The Great Comets of 1618. In 1618, 3 comets were seen in the skies over Europe, with the third apparition in December being the brightest. Comets were perceived to be portents of doom, and the 30 Years' War followed shortly thereafter. Now, Native Americans also saw these comets, and they also interpreted them to be a very bad sign. So with Brewster still in hiding, John Carver and Robert Cushman took up negotiations with officials in London, and by June 1619, they had secured a charter from the Virginia Company. But one problem was they were broke and they couldn't finance the venture. Nearly broke. Then Cushman learned that a group similar to their own, led by a man named Blackwell, left that winter for Virginia with 180 English separatists from Emden, Holland. By the time they arrived in America, 130, including Blackwell himself, were dead. So this gave the Pilgrims pause about their intended journey across the Atlantic. Now, when the Dutch government learned of the Pilgrims' intentions to emigrate, they covertly undermined their attempts to finance an expedition, fearing they would encroach upon their desired location that would become the settlement of New Amsterdam. The Pilgrims then turned to a wealthy English merchant, along with 70 of his British business partners, known as the Merchant Adventurers. The man's name was Thomas Weston. And they saw 2 opportunities: investment in a way to plant their religion in a foreign land. And their charter specified that they could establish a settlement in northern Virginia, which in reality was at the mouth of the Hudson River. Now, Weston proposed that they form a joint stock company, whereby the adventurers would finance the voyage, and in return, the Pilgrims would generate profits through cod fishing and the fur trade. For the next 7 years, the Pilgrims would agree to work for 5 days a week for their investors, 2 days a week for themselves, and a 1-day rest on the Sabbath. About 1/3 of the Pilgrims, approximately 125, prepared for the journey west. Then Weston changed the terms of their agreement. Now the Pilgrims must work for the investors for 6 days a week, with only 1 day off for the Sabbath. And Robert Cushman agreed to these new terms without even consulting the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims wanted to reach the Hudson River before winter, and by June 1620, Weston still had not secured any transportation for them. And now Weston insisted adding non-separatists to the expedition. Among these strangers, as they were called, included a wicked man, a mean man by the name of Christopher Martin, and he would be directing the venture and the future settlement, including the congregation of Pilgrims. And they used Christopher Martin as a purchasing agent to procure supplies and provisions for the voyage. They needed beer, wine, hardtack, salted beef, salt pork, dried peas, fishing supplies, which he never got, muskets, armor, clothing, tools, trade goods, and a screwjack that would come in handy even before they reached America. And they also had to secure them seeds, barley and wheat. They had to grow that for beer. But Martin refused to work with the Pilgrims like John Carver and Robert Cushman, and no one knew where they stood in regard to provisions for the trip, and it was just weeks away. Then the Pilgrims purchased a 60-ton vessel named the Speedwell, piloted by a man named Reynolds. And by the end of July 1620, the Pilgrims had made their way to Delfshaven, where the Speedwell was waiting. The plan was for them to rendezvous in Southampton, where the others, with their supposed provisions along with another ship, would be waiting for them. It was a sad and mournful parting, according to William Bradford, as he left his 3-year-old son behind with Dorothy's parents. Now, the Speedwell was 50 feet in length, a small boat, and it had been recently refitted with 2 larger masts to endure the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. But this modification would eventually make her unseaworthy. Weston had now secured a second vessel known as the Mayflower, a square-rigged merchant ship with high superstructures that was about 100 feet in length and could carry 180 tons or 180 casks of wine. Now, the Mayflower was piloted by Master Christopher Jones, who had crossed the English Channel with a cargo of wine several times previously, and he traveled as far as Scandinavia and Greenland. And they called this a sweet ship. And that's because the spilled wine helped tamp down the odor emanating from the bilge. Now, Jones's mate and pilot was Robert Coppin, who had previously traveled to America. And 21-year-old John Alden was the cooper, in charge of all casks and barrels on board the ship, the quartermaster, provisions. Also on board was Miles Standish. He was hired as a mercenary, designated to be in charge of all military affairs, along with his wife, Rose. Elder William Brewster was joined by his wife, Mary, and their sons, Love and Wrestling. And Stephen Hopkins was on the Mayflower as well, along with his pregnant wife, Elizabeth. Also his son, Giles, and daughters, Constance and Damaris, along with 2 servants, Edward Doty and Edward Lester. Now, Hawkins had been to America previously aboard the Sea Venture, which had shipwrecked in Bermuda in 1609. He had been charged with mutiny, and the story was the basis for Shakespeare's The Tempest. Now, Edward Winslow was accompanied by his wife, Elizabeth. John Clark was also a co-pilot who had been to America once before, so they weren't flying blindly there. Christopher Jones had 2 men that had been there and knew the way. And Giles Healy was the ship's physician. John Carver's wife, Catherine, along with 5 servants, were passengers as well. Now, the ornery Christopher Martin, who was designated as the Mayflower's governor, traveled with his wife and 2 servants, along with 4 additional families, the Mullinses, the Eatons, and the Billingtons. Bradford referred to as one of the most profanest families amongst them. Ellen Jasper and Richard and Mary Moore were sent on the voyage by their stepfather, Samuel. And John Billington, a drunkard and troublemaker, was joined by his wife Eleanor and their sons John and Francis. But suddenly, just as they were about to leave, After a disagreement with Thomas Weston, he pulled all of his financial backing of the voyage and walked off the ship, and the Pilgrims were forced to sell off some of their provisions, including butter. So Martin was now behaving like a despot, cursing out all the Pilgrims at each turn. And because of this, Cushman made sure that he was on board the other vessel, the Speedwell. So they departed Southampton, and the Speedwell became as open and leaky as a sieve, according to Bradford. Several days after clearing the Isle of Wight, they had to turn back and head to Dartmouth for repairs. It was now August 17th, and the ship lay dormant in Dartmouth, awaiting the westerly winds. Now, they had consumed almost half of their provisions, and they weren't even out of the harbor yet. Once they were sailing again, about 200 miles off the British coast, the Speedwell sprang more leaks, and they were forced to turn back to Plymouth, England, and abandon her. The loss of the ship was costly. Maybe, they speculate, historians do, that Mr. Reynolds had deliberately overmasted the ship because he didn't want to go to the New World. You can see the trail there as they came out of Leiden, stopping in Southampton, then with repairs in Dartmouth, out to sea, then back to Plymouth. So now they're down to one ship. So Cushman left the group, and the remaining passengers all crowded aboard the Mayflower, 102 in all, of which less than 50 were separatists. On September 6th, I'm going to use the old style date, the first date, 1620, under what Bradford described as a prosperous wind, the Mayflower departed from Plymouth, England. Anyways, on board, they might have had some chickens. We're not sure. I don't think they did. Or sheep or goats. They came over in the second voyage, but I've discussed with a number of historians. But they did have two dogs, an English Spaniel, and also a giant Mastiff, hunting dogs. And the living quarters for the 102 passengers were cramped, with the living area about 80 feet by 20 feet and the ceiling about 5 feet high. With couples and children packed closely together for a trip lasting 2 months, there was virtually no privacy. When someone became sick, quickly others fell ill. They were suffering from vitamin deficiencies and malnutrition, and they were cold, wet. Fever and flu struck nearly everybody on board, but strangely, men such as Miles Standish never became ill. So the first half of the voyage proceeded over calm seas and under pleasant skies. But then the weather changed, with continuous northeasterly storms hurling themselves against the ship and huge waves constantly crashing against the topside deck. In the midst of one storm, the servant of physician Samuel Fuller died and was buried at sea, the first casualty. During another fierce storm, the sails could not be used, and the ship was forced to drift without hoisting its sails for days. The passengers were forced to crouch in semi-darkness below deck as ocean swells rose to over 40 feet. And with waves tossing the boat in different directions and the passengers clinging to each other, everybody was soaked to the bone. And the storm had so badly damaged its main beam that the crew thought that the ship would actually sink. Fortunately, they had that metal jack screw that I told you about. And that would be used in the construction of later in new settler homes. But for this, they used it to secure the beam so they could continue their voyage. They continued on, but now their food supplies were nearly depleted. And they were low on drinking water, but more importantly, beer. The water was rancid, cholera and other diseases were infested in fresh water. Immediately, the passengers became seasick, and they were mocked by a sailor whom Bradford called a proud and very profane young man. The sailor would curse and mock the Pilgrims, and he couldn't wait to throw their bodies overboard when they were dead. Ironically, he would be the first to succumb at sea, and the Pilgrims took that as their first sign from God. Now, during the crossing, as a violent storm lay siege on the Mayflower, a servant by the name of John Howland ventured topside for a breath of fresh air. He was immediately swept off the deck. Somehow, as he fell into the sea, sure to drown in the cold waters, he grabbed a halyard, which was a rope dangling alongside the ship. Despite going 10 feet underwater, he was pulled aboard with a boat hook and saved. He would go on to marry Elizabeth Tilley, who was considered the prettiest on the vessel, and they would go on to marry, have 11 children and 88 grandchildren. Today, their diaspora and line of heritage can account for over 1.5 million people all over the globe. The crossing was slow and tedious, and they averaged a speed of about 2 miles per hour, bucking the undiscovered Gulf Stream and the westerly gales. Most of the passengers were now gravely ill, and Master Christopher Jones was using a map by explorer John Smith, and he was desperate to make landfall to get these sick people off his ship. And that's the John Smith map, and we'll talk about that. Since about the year 1519, European fishing vessels were occasionally seen on the horizon by the native inhabitants. For instance, Bartholomew Gosnold was among the first Europeans to make landfall in northern Maine. He would travel south along the coast to Cape Cod, and there he observed the natives, probably Nausets, running on shore, gawking at the sight of his ship. He was the first European to discover Martha's Vineyard, and he built a temporary fort on the Elizabeth Islands at Cuttyhunk in the year 1602. Now, the earliest settlers of the Elizabeth Islands were the Wampanoag Native Americans. The tribe did not settle permanently on the Elizabeth Islands, but used them in the summer for hunting, fishing, and gardening. Occasionally, arrowheads or stone tools are discovered on the islands. So the natives would use the coastline in the summer, and then in the winter, they'd go into the interior. Martin Pring was an English explorer from Bristol, England, who in 1603 was captain of an expedition to North America to assess commercial potential. He explored areas of present-day Maine, New Hampshire, and Cape Cod in Massachusetts. In the process, he named what is now Plymouth Harbor Whitsun Bay, and the nearby hill Mount Aldworth, after the two Bristol merchants who provided him with ships and supplies. Now, his crew were the first known Europeans to ascend the Piscataqua River, and it's thought that Italian explorer Verrazano explored this part of the New England coast in 1524 to 1525, looking for a route to the far east, but he did not make landfall until he reached the St. Lawrence River. In 1606, Pring returned to America and mapped the Maine coast. He sailed into a bay in New Hampshire in search of sassafras, then considered to be an elixir of life in Western Europe. They moved down the coast to the Pamet River in Truro, Cape Cod, and they built a fort at the foot of Corn Hill, which would be later discovered by the Pilgrims. But soon conflict arose. Pring's men had deceived the Nausets in trade, and Pring's ship was attacked by a large force of natives. His ships fired cannons at them, and he unleashed two large mastiff dogs upon them. As the ship departed, warriors of Pring's men burned the woods on the shoreline as more than 200 warriors shouted at the sailors. Some accounts say that the natives burned the shoreline. They had no reason to do it. It was Pring's men that burnt their fort. George Weymouth, explorer from England, who discovered the area which is now Maine, also a slaver. In 1602, Weymouth was hired to seek a northwest passage to India by the recently formed East India Company, and he sailed the ship Discovery 300 miles into Hudson Strait. He would later return near Monhegan off the coast of Maine on May 17, 1605, and chronicler James Rozier, who was on board, wrote that Monhegan was woody, grown with fir, birch, oak, and beech, as far as we say along shore, and so likely to be within. On the verge grow gooseberries, strawberries, wild peas, and wild rose bushes. And there Weymouth and his men lured natives on board their ship, and he kidnapped them, taking some of them back to England as slaves and to use in sideshows. Adrian Block, a Dutch privateer, a pirate, who is best known for exploring the coastal and river valley areas between present-day New Jersey and Massachusetts during 4 voyages from 1611 to 1614, following the 1609 expedition by Henry Hudson. He's noted for naming Block Island in Rhode Island and established early trade with the Native Americans. The 1614 map of his voyage features details of the mid-Atlantic region for the first time, and on which the term New Netherland is first applied to the region. He is credited with being the first European to enter Long Island Sound and the Connecticut River, and to determine that Manhattan and Long Island were islands. He may have established peaceful relations with the indigenous peoples, as he was after the burgeoning and lucrative trade in beaver pelts, because beaver fur was all the rage in Europe and it was water resistant. In late 1613, his ship, the Tiger, burned to the waterline, and the local Lenape tribe helped him build a new ship. Now, there's not a record here of conflict with the native inhabitants, which stuns me actually when you talk about European exploiters. So, according to oral tradition and archaeological evidence, the Wampanoags, or Wampanoags, had occupied this area for nearly 10,000 years and consisted of a population of around 12,000 people by the time of the explorer Samuel de Champlain's mapping expedition around Plymouth Harbor, and he called Plymouth Harbor Port St. Louis in 1605. And that's his map there. The Charles River. And now John Smith. In 1606, John Smith became involved with the Virginia Company of London's plan to colonize Virginia for profit, and King James had already granted a charter. During the voyage to Virginia, though, Smith was charged with mutiny, and Captain Christopher Newport placed him under arrest and planned to execute him. However, when they landed at Cape Henry on April 26, 1607, and unsealed orders from the Virginia Company, they saw that Smith was now designated as one of the new leaders of the colony, so he was released. As the colony starved and began to die off, Smith tried to obtain food from the local Indians, but it required threats of military force for them to comply. So Smith discovered there were those among both the settlers and the Indians who were planning to take his life, and he was warned about the plan by Pocahontas. He called a meeting and threatened those who were not working that he that will not work shall not eat. After that, the situation improved and the settlers worked with more industry. Smith would later claim that he was captured by the Powhatan twice, and that Pocahontas begged her father, the Sachem, the chief, to spare his life on both occasions. We don't know if that's true, but just to put the pieces together, had Pocahontas not spared Smith, Smith wouldn't have come up the New England coast 7 years later and made the map that was used by the Pilgrims. Anyway, Smith was severely injured by a gunpowder explosion in his canoe, and he sailed to England for treatment in mid-October 1609, and he never returned to Virginia again. In 1614, he returned to America in a voyage to the coasts of Maine and Massasoit Bay. Smith was given command of the mission and set out in 1614 with 2 whaling ships and 2 subordinate commanders, Captain Michael Cooper and a man by the name of Thomas Hunt, a 20-year-old captain. So while the 2 ships kept busy fishing off the coast of Maine, Smith took a crew of 8 in a small boat to explore the northeastern coast of America, from Maine to as far south as Cape Cod, where he would obtain 11,000 beaver and otter pelts from the natives. He would name the region New England, and the commercial purpose was to take whales for fins and oil and to seek out mines of gold and copper, but both of these proved impractical, so the voyage turned to collecting fish and furs to defray the expense. Now, on his map, which was first published in 1616, Cape Cod was called Cape James, an apparent gift to the English monarch, but fortunately, this name didn't gain traction, and Bartholomew Gosnold's original name of Cape Cod endured. Indian place names were now replaced by the names of English cities at the request of Prince Charles. The settlers of Plymouth Colony adopted the name that Smith gave to that area. Other place names on the map survive today, such as the Charles River, marked as the River Charles, and Cape Ann, marked as Cape Anna. And during this time, as he made his way along the south shore of Massasoit Bay, he became involved in a fracas with the Quanahasset tribe as he passed by the rocky ledges of modern-day Cohasset. The natives fired arrows while Smith's men exchanged musket fire, allegedly killing one native and wounding another in the thigh at a place called Hominy Point. Today they call it Smith's Rock. Smith collected a ship's cargo worth of furs, train oil, and core fish and returned to England, stocked full of beaver and otter pelts and fish. However, the expedition's second vessel under the command of Thomas Hunt stayed behind. They captured a number of Indians as slaves, including Squanto of the Patuxet tribe. So when Smith started back to England, he told Hunt to stay behind for a while and pick up from the Indians a load of fish, skins, and other items to bring back. But Hunt went beyond these instructions. He had other plans. Offering to trade beaver, Hunt lured 27 Nauset and Patuxet Indians on board his ship, and he took them captive. Sir Ferdinando Gorges, head of the Council for New England, remembered it similarly. He said, "One Hunt, a worthless fellow of our nation, set out by certain merchants for love of gain, who, not content with the commodity he had by the fish, and peaceable trade he found among the savages, after he had made his dispatch and was ready to set sail, more savage-like than they, he seized upon the poor innocent creatures that in his confidence of his honesty had put themselves into his hands. He was a slaver. So Hunt stored the Indians below the hatches and sailed them to the Straits of Gibraltar and on to the city of Malaga, Spain, where he sold as many of them as he could. But when some local friars in Malaga discovered that they had been brought from America, they took custody of the remaining Indians and instructed them in the Christian faith. As Sir Ferdinando Gorges states, the friars so disappointed this unworthy fellow of the hopes of gain he conceived to make by this new and devilish project. Now, Gorges would take his own slaves. I mentioned Squanto. He was known as Squantum, a brave, the Patuxet tribes. And so now the Patuxet tribes became, and the Nasa tribe became very hostile, and they were outraged by these kidnappings, these taking of slaves. And after this, English and French ships visiting Plymouth and Cape Cod were no longer welcomed with the profitable fur and fish trade. In the popular lore of the early English settlers, a crew of Frenchmen were said to have shipwrecked along the Cape Cod coast and taken captive and enslaved by the Nassets. The party was taken by the local Nassets, and most of them were executed, but not before evoking a divine curse against their native captors. According to Thomas Morton, in a short time thereafter, the hand of God fell heavily upon the Nassets with such a mortal stroke that they died on heaps as they lay in their houses. The two remaining survivors were ransomed to the English captain Thomas Dermer. Now, John Smith was convinced that Hunt's actions were directed at him. By inflaming the local population, Smith said he could prevent that intent. I had to make a plantation there, keeping the country in obscurity so that Hunt and a few merchants monopolized it. According to Smith, Hunt had taken his maps and notes of the area to defeat Smith's settlement plans. He could not believe that Hunt was driven by greed, since there was little private gain to be gotten, and Hunt sold those silly salvages for riles of 8. Smith made 2 attempts in 1614 and 1615 to return to the same coast, but his ship was demasted by a storm on the first trip, and on the second attempt, he was captured by French pirates off the coast of the Azores. He escaped after weeks of captivity and made his way back to England, where he published an account of his 2 voyages as A Description of New England, and he remained in England for the rest of his life. So Smith noted that the people inhabiting the coasts from Maine to Cape Cod had large cornfields and great troops of well-proportioned people, and that the French had been so successful in trade with the natives because they came in peace, whereas English merchants came with weapons and arrogance. And Smith believed that it was too late to reverse this reality, even with diplomacy. So he advocated, we need military force. And he suggested that the English adventurers should rely on his own experience in wars around the world and his experience in New England, whereas few men could engage in what he called silly encounters without injury or long-term hostility. He also compared the experience of the Spaniards in determining how many armed men were necessary to effect compliance. Far larger than its title, Smith's book outlined his vision for the New World. He specifically identified the part of the region that became Massachusetts as having all the elements needed for building and sustaining a colony and ripe for exploitation. They had fertile land, fresh water, timber, fish, and fur in New England. No gold. He identified one specific spot that he claimed had an excellent good harbor, good land, and no want of anything but industrious people. This is the very spot where the Mayflower Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony, a former village of the Patuxet. That's where it is right there, you can see. The original inhabitants of Patuxet were Algonquin, and they apparently used it as a summer resort. For at least 3 places along the shore were rich in relics indicating such use, and lobsters were abundant at that time, and Joseph Jocelyn, an early visitor, wrote of an Indian lad spearing 30 lobsters from his canoe in an hour and a half. Nothing further has been learned of Captain Thomas Hunt, though it's believed that he was discredited and disgraced in England for his actions in kidnapping the Indians, and thereafter he had difficulty obtaining commissions. But seeing that Patuxet was decimated by disease, could one of Hunt's men been a super spreader 2 years before the supposed epidemic breakout year of 1616? Remember, Patuxet was decimated. 95% of their inhabitants they lost. And the Great Dying, which I'll get to in just a moment, historians will tell you that it was a French fur trapper who was brought ashore by the local natives in northern Maine, and they all got sick from him, and the disease came south along the coastal areas. This is what weakened the Wampanoag Nation. Now, this disease wiped out Massasoit tribes, Nauset, Wampanoag, Pokanoket, but for some reason it did not affect the Narragansett, who were rivals with Massasoit in the Wampanoag Federation. And I believe that they practiced social distancing. That is, they went into the interior of the woodlands until this disease, this outbreak died down. Just my theory. Now, or did the infected man or the men or fur traders or fishermen or infected native travel from the northern Maine coast after infecting the native population there and then dock at Patuxet? Perhaps. Now, this is according to King James, typical of his personality. Within these late years, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so as there is not left any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. We in our judgment are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time to come in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us, and our people hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by the natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects. The Pilgrims thought it was Providence when they found this land open and skeleton, bleached bones lying on the ground. But the Indians had died so quickly they didn't even have time to bury their dead. About 60,000 Indians lived in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut at the start of the 17th century, according to Sherburne Cook. And Maine had a robust population of Abenaki tribes. According to some estimates, Maine had more than 20,000 Penobscot, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy Indians. And the Passamaquoddy, by the way, were the first to make contact with Europeans, and they were actually devastated by a typhus epidemic in the year 1586. And then comes the Great Dying, 1616 to 1619, just prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. And the introduction of European diseases to the Wabanaki was devastating. From 1616 to 1619, nearly all of the native inhabitants along the coast were wiped out. It swept New England from Maine all the way down to Cape Cod. And we believe now the native people death rate was as high as 90 to 95%. And among the Wabanaki, they had a more spread out population. Their death rate was more than 75%. Now, the specific agent responsible for this epidemic has not been identified specifically, but it may have been a plague, maybe smallpox or viral hepatitis. It has been categorized as a virgin soil epidemic. You see, the Native Americans did not have the immunities and antibodies to fight off animal-borne viruses and diseases. The specific agent responsible for this epidemic has not been specifically identified, but it may have been plague, smallpox, or viral hepatitis. It's been categorized as a virgin soil epidemic. The natives in America did not have immunities or antibodies to animal-borne diseases. The Europeans had lived for thousands of years with the big six. That is sheep, goat, cattle, horses, pigs, and poultry. And these people had built up natural immunities to these animal-borne diseases. And like today, they didn't even know that they were still carrying the disease and that they could infect others. So further north, though, along the Maine coast, where natives had more sustained contact with French traders, some of the earliest reports of disease outbreak were made. So yes, certainly French traders did bring the disease to northern Maine. Question is, who brought it to Plymouth? And in 1616, Father Pierre Baird, he was a French Jesuit missionary, he noted that the Abenaki are astonished and often complain that since the French mingle and carry on trade with them, they are dying fast and the population is thinning out. That same year, Captain Richard Vines, an English explorer, wintered on the Maine coast, and he noted that the local natives were sore afflicted with the plague, for that the country was in a manner left void of inhabitants. Soon the mysterious disease spread throughout the coastal region. following the trade routes of the Abenaki, who traded furs for corn and other provisions from the tribes to the south, and turned the loose confederation of Algonquian villages that dotted the area into an apocalyptic wasteland. Native Americans did not possess the necessary immunities to fight off these animal-borne diseases that originated in Europe and Asia. And as I mentioned, the Europeans and Asians had developed the necessary antibodies over thousands of years to fight off the diseases that mainly came from chickens, pigs, and cattle. These animals were not native to the New World. The only beast of burden here in New England, actually there's more to Central America, would be the llama. They didn't even have the wheel. So Thomas Morton once again offers a vivid account of the landscape left behind. For in a place where many inhabited, there hath been but one left alive, to tell what became of the rest, the living being as it seems not able to bury the dead. They were left for the crows, kites, and vermin to prey upon, and the bones and skulls upon the several places of their habitations made such a spectacle after my coming into those parts, it seemed to me a new-found Golgotha. Disease continued to ravage the Massachusetts Bay shoreline, wiping out the native populations by the thousands. The epidemic covered an area that spanned from the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers of southern Maine to the Narragansett Bay of Rhode Island, with the highest rate of fatalities concentrated around Boston Harbor and Plymouth Bay. Sailing along the Massachusetts coast in 1619, Captain Thomas Dermer described the impact on the region, noting that the ancient plantations, not long since populous, now lay utterly void. In other places, a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. Edward Winslow, who acted as an early delegate between the Pilgrims and the surviving Wampanoag tribesmen, described the disease as being not unlike the plague, if not the same. There were certainly symptoms reported that are consistent with plague infection, that is, headache, nosebleeds, subepidermal hemorrhages, and multiple contemporary witnesses noted that the native dwellings were overrun by fleas. However, the case for plague, either bubonic or septicemic or pneumonic, is unconvincing. For one thing, there were no reports of the telltale buboes, that's swollen lymph nodes, associated with plague affliction. The Algonquian community structure also lacked the necessary population density for a plague virus to spread so rapidly and have such a devastating mortality rate. And finally, the New England climate is unsuitable for the Xenophila chiopus flea, which is the known carrier of Yersinia pestis bacterium. Smallpox is another strong candidate, and the reported pock marks on the victims seem to point in this direction. But critics of this theory note that it was uncommon for the adult Europeans, who through generations of exposure had by this time developed some level of resistance, to contract the smallpox virus, and unlikely that the disease would have survived a 6-week sea voyage made by explorers before running its course. Large-scale migration of European children would not take place for at least another decade, a factor which contributed heavily to the confirmed smallpox epidemic that ravaged parts of New England in 1633. In fact, studying the Narragansett language, Roger Williams, founder of the Rhode Island Colony, interviewed survivors of both epidemics who made a point of distinction between the 1616 to 1619 plague and the 1633 pox, using two different words in their native tongue to describe two different forms of disease. And I believe that. In his study of the Massachusetts tribe, early colonist Daniel Gookin notes that he discoursed with some old Indians who were in their youth at the time of the epidemic, who say that the bodies all over were exceedingly yellow, and described it by a yellow garment that they showed me, both before they died and afterwards. This has led to speculation that perhaps the plague was in fact yellow fever. However, this theory has largely been discounted since the epidemic lasted through the cold New England winters, and that would be impossible for a vector-borne disease to survive. Other potential maladies that have been raised by medical historians include hepatitis, meningitis, typhus, chickenpox, pneumonia, trichinosis, influenza, and most recently, leptospirosis. But as of yet, all attempts to identify the nature of the 1616 to 1619 epidemic remain inconclusive. Back to Squanto. The friars tried to convert to Squantum during the time that he lived with them to Christianity, but his heart still yearned for home, so he then escaped to England, where he learned the English language. And he then had been living in England with the Newfoundland Coopers or Cupid's Cove colony treasurer by the name of John Slaney. When the opportunity came to travel back to the New World, he shipped back across the ocean to assist in setting up the Newfoundland colony at Cooper's Cove, which was a fur trading colony set up in 1610. There it is. Thomas Dermer, you've heard me mention his name a few times. While in Newfoundland, Squantum encountered a ship's captain by the name of Thomas Dermer, who had worked with Captain John Smith, perhaps even on that 1614 mapping expedition in which Squanto had originally been taken. Anyways, Dermer was employed by the New England Company headed by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and they still had hopes to profit from the beaver trade with the Indians of Massachusetts, but this would not be possible as long as hostilities remained. So Thomas Dermer recognized that Squantum, who had now been living with Englishmen for a number of years, could act as an interpreter and peacemaker between the English and the still enraged Indians of the Patuxet and Nauset tribes. So in 1619, Captain Dermer and Squantum set off for New England to attempt to make peace and reestablish trade with the Indians, and to map out the natural resources that could be exploited by the company. But upon arriving, they discovered Squantum's town, all of the Patuxet were dead from the plague. But he did make contact with Massasoit and Massasoit's brother, Quatakina, who were heads of the Wampanoag Confederation, and in the absence of his own people, he took up residence with them in their town. Their plan to make peace was foiled by the fact that Squantum's tribe had been completely wiped out. And meanwhile, Dermer was captured by natives at Nemasket, and Squanto came to negotiate his release, and he returned to England. Dermer did. Squanto stayed. That's Nemasket there. Now, Epenow was a strong, intelligent Wampanoag Indian who lived on Martha's Vineyard. In 1611, Captain Edward Harlow captured him while exploring the New England coast. And allegedly, Harlow had been commissioned by Sir Ferdinando Gorges to kidnap Indians for slaves while they explored the New World. Gotcha. Gorges was a slaver. All told, Harlow brought 30 Indian captives back to London, intending to sell them to the Spanish as slaves. And he took Epenow with him. Now, Londoners were fascinated by the exotic American Indians brought to England by explorers, and the captives became sideshow attractions in street carnivals, in coffee houses and taverns, and even Shakespeare probably saw Epenow in person, and he was probably thinking of Epenow when he mentioned a strange Indian in his play Henry VIII. Now, Gorges took Epenow as his own slave, and he housed him with another Indian by the name of Assakumet, who taught him English. That allowed Epenow to observe Gorges's hopes and dreams and to figure out a way to get back home. And he persuaded Gorges he could show him a gold mine on Martha's Vineyard. All he had to do was take him there. And Gorges took the bait. He commissioned a voyage to Martha's Vineyard with Epenow and one or two other Indians along as translators and guides. And also backing the trip were Shakespeare's sponsor, the Earl of Southampton, and Captain Nicholas Hobson. Gorges didn't completely trust his Indian slave, so he ordered Hobson to guard him closely and to dress him in long clothing that he could be grabbed easily. And when Hobson sailed into the harbor at Martha's Vineyard, Epenow's people greeted the vessel peacefully, and Hobson invited them aboard the ship. Once the Wampanoags came on deck, Epenow quietly hatched an escape plan with them. The Indians told Hobson they'd return with trade goods the next day. And then when they returned, they showed up with 20 canoes, but they refused to board the ship. Hobson talked and gestured, but the Indians remained standoffish. Then Hobson called Epenow out of the hold to translate. Epenow welcomed his people in English, which they didn't understand. Then he instructed them in his own tongue, which the English didn't understand. And then he tried to lunge off the ship, and the crew grabbed hold of his clothing. He was so big and heavy and strong, he dove overboard. When he hit the water, the Indians shot arrows at the ship. The English returned fire, killing some of the Indians, but Captain Hobson and the crew were wounded. The ship returned to England without any gold or the Indian slaves, and Hobson told Gorges that Epenow had been killed. Wasn't. Epenow had no use for the English from then on, and he became a sachem on Martha's Vineyard, and he led the Indians' resistance to the colonizers. In 1619, Captain Thomas Dermer came back to Martha's Vineyard, and Epenow visited with him peacefully, and he told him, actually he was laughing, about his escape. Dermer returned the next year in 1620, shortly before the Pilgrims arrived. So Thomas Dermer returned the next year, 1620, shortly before the Pilgrims arrived. And he managed to pick up Squanto, and Squanto came aboard as a guide. But due to an incident during that spring, whereby a fur trading ship invited Epenow's men aboard for trade and then executed them, Epenow's men were not so friendly this time around, and they attacked Dermer and his crew, and they retook Squanto and killed everyone except for Dermer. Dermer was wounded, and he escaped to Virginia, where he later died. Squanto was now a captive, but he was eventually returned to Massasoit by Epenow. Back to our story. John Smith lobbied the Pilgrims to take him with them, but the Pilgrims demurred, preferring to take his maps instead of his domineering persona. After all, the Pilgrims would be dependent upon and at the will of Captain Smith had he been aboard the Mayflower. Smith insisted later that had the Pilgrims read his map and taken advice and gone to Boston, it would have been a more suitable settlement. Now, back to the Mayflower. It's daybreak after 65 days at sea, November 9th or 19th, 1620, and after seeing seagulls and the ocean beginning to turn from the color deep blue to a shade of green, a look outside at what John Smith had called in his map Cape James. They saw the sands of Cape Cod, the long sandy arm that had been explored in 1602 by Bartholomew Gosnold. So the passengers were delighted to see the autumn colors of the trees and the abundance of them. Again, timber was scarce now in Europe. Jones tried to make his way south to the Hudson, the original and chartered destination, but the winds were now against him. And you can see in that map, by the way, the yellow line, 1620 border between Virginia and New England. Now, Thomas Weston had originally thought that a more northerly settlement would be conducive to cornering the European market on codfish. And each spring since about the year 1519, hundreds of fishing vessels from England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland lurked off the coast of Maine at the Grand Banks. But the Pilgrims' legally granted land was 220 miles to the south. So you can see the route here, and they began to head south along the Cape. The wind was in their favor, but then suddenly at 1 o'clock, the winds and the tides shifted, and they were now approaching one of the most dangerous shoals in North America, Pollock Rip, or Pollock's Rip. An alarmed Christopher Jones immediately realized that the destruction of the Mayflower was imminent. Bradford said, "They fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and they were so far entangled therewith as they conceived themselves in great danger." See the route there. But then, with the changing of the tide, the wind, and the current, by 4:35 p.m., Jones moved the Mayflower northwest of Pollock Rip, and they were out of danger. They drifted off the coast of Chatham until dawn on November 10th. And at this point, to the alarm of the passengers, Jones made the fateful decision to turn the tip of Cape Cod and anchor in Provincetown Harbor. His ship was full of sick people. He wanted to get them off, get them settled, and head back to England. So on November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower's anchor was dropped in Provincetown Harbor at Long Point. We could go into a bunch of maps like this, right there. Now, of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower, there were 50 men, 19 women, and 33 young adults and children. Just 41 were true pilgrims, that is, religious separatists seeking freedom from the Church of England. 25 to 30 were crewmen and officers, those bad neighbors. The Billington family appeared a number of times in the accounts of early Plymouth Colony, and they were reported to be the colony's troublemakers. For instance, young Francis, the son, fired a musket on board the Mayflower while the ship was anchored off Cape Cod, showering sparks near casks of gunpowder. Francis went exploring soon after their arrival. He climbed a tree and he saw the Billington Sea. Discovered the Billington Sea. That's why they called it that. And then in March of 1621, John Sr. challenged Miles Standish's orders for contempt of the captain's lawful command with several speeches, and he was punished for it. He would do this many times more. And then May of 1621, John Billington the Younger became lost in some woods for several days and weeks, eventually being returned home by some natives from the Nemasket on Cape Cod. In 1624, John Billington was implicated in the Oldham Lyford scandal, which was a revolt against the rule of the Plymouth Church, but insisted he was innocent and he was never officially punished. In 1625, Governor Bradford wrote a letter to Robert Cushman saying, "Billington still rails against you. He is a knave, and so will live and died." In September 1630, John Billington was tried by a jury and hanged for the murder of John Newcomen, whom he considered to be an enemy. This was the first such execution in Plymouth Colony, and Bradford states he was approximately 40 years old at the time of his hanging. In 1636, Billington's wife Eleanor was sentenced to sit in the stocks and be whipped for slandering John Doane. Let's look at the women of the Mayflower. 18 adult women boarded the Mayflower at Plymouth, with 3 of them at least 6 months pregnant. Elizabeth Hopkins, who gave birth to a boy named Oceanus during the voyage. Susanna White, who gave birth to Peregrine White on board the Mayflower in Cape Cod Harbor on November 20th. And then Mary Norris Allerton, who unfortunately gave birth to a stillborn on board the Mayflower that December. When the ship arrived in Cape Cod, the men went ashore on 5 exploration missions, while the women stayed on board the Mayflower to care for the sick and the young in damp, cramped squalor, which meant many would die before they were able to step foot on land. Because of these conditions, just 5 women would make it through that first harsh winter. There are precious few records of the women who boarded the Mayflower, but their strength and role in the dramatic voyage and in settling in a new land, including cooking the first Thanksgiving, cannot be underestimated. Women in 1620 had little rights, and their history is patchy, and little thought was given to the recording any of their endeavors. So it must have been absolutely awful for them. Susanna gave birth to Peregrine while the ship was anchored in Cape Cod in late November 1620. She also traveled with a 5-year-old son called Resolved, and Peregrine would become known as the firstborn child of New England, and he would go on to become a prominent farmer and military captain. Susanna's husband, William, however, would sadly die weeks and months later in February of 1621. Now, Susanna, now with a newborn son and a 5-year-old to care for, was the only widow who survived that perishing first winter in America, and one of 5 women to do so. The others were Elizabeth Hopkins, Mary Brewster, Eleanor Billington, and Catherine Carver, who sadly died in May of 1621. Originally from one of the Pilgrims' villages in Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, England, she would marry again, this time to widower Edward Winslow, and this would be the first marriage in the new Plymouth Colony on May 12, 1621, and they would go on to have 5 children. Susanna would certainly have been one of the more prominent figures in the new settlement, married to Edward, who was a leader in the community. Elizabeth Hopkins would give birth while at sea to a boy she aptly named Oceanus, who would tragically die after 2 years when the Pilgrims had settled into a life of hardship in their new surroundings. Now, Elizabeth survived the first winter to cook the first Thanksgiving feast, but little is known of her origins or what would become of her. She married Stephen Hopkins in February 1617, and they had a daughter, Damaris, born somewhere in England around 1618. And they were part of a group of pilgrims known as the Strangers, who were not part of the congregation of separatists living in Leiden, Holland. The Strangers made up more than half the Mayflower passengers, and there were merchants, craftsmen, skilled workers, and indentured servants, no farmers, and also 3 young orphans. All were common people, and about 1/3 of them were children, and they were crucial to the colony's success. They would have initially boarded the Mayflower in Holland before they met up with the leaking Speedwell in Southampton, and they would stop again in Dartmouth and Plymouth before setting off for America. Now, Mary Norris Allerton, was possibly born in Welford, England in 1592, and she wed Isaac Allerton or Allerton in November 1611. She was around 30 years old when they traveled to North America, with their husband, Isaac, and 3 children. She was an active member in the Leiden Church, and she was pregnant when she left Leiden on the Speedwell for Southampton before transferring to the Mayflower. She and Isaac had already buried a child in Leiden in February 1620 before she gave birth to a stillborn son in Plymouth in the harbor while the Mayflower was docked on December 23, 1620. Now, Mary herself died during that first winter in February of 1621, though her husband and her 3 children survived. 4 years later, Isaac Allerton remarried Fear Brewster, who was the daughter of Elder William Brewster, and they had 2 children, Sarah and Isaac. And after the death of his second wife, Allerton then moved to Marblehead, and he remarried Joanna Swinnerton in 1637, and he would eventually die in New Haven, Connecticut in 1659. Priscilla Mullins Alden. Priscilla was not one of the 18 women recorded to have crossed the stormy Atlantic, because she was just a teenager at the time and one that had a hard start to her new life. Her father, William Mullins, died on February 21, 1621, while the ship was docked for 4 months. And Priscilla's mother and brother, Allerton Joseph, died in that first winter as well, meaning Priscilla started life in America as an orphan at the age of 18. Now, she went on to marry John Alden in what is thought to be the 3rd marriage in the Plymouth Colony. And she was one of the surviving women who became a family and fought throughout the hardship to help the colony eventually thrive. She is best known for the poem The Courtship of Miles Standish by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. According to Longfellow's legend, John Alden spoke to Priscilla Mullins on behalf of Miles Standish, who was too shy in talking to the lovely young lady, so he asked Alden to propose on his behalf, and Priscilla said, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" And they were married. Priscilla would become a leading figure in the colony, and by 1627 they were living in a house in the hillside across from the governor's house and near the fort. Now, John Alden served in various offices in the government of the colony, and he was elected as assistant to the governor and to Plymouth Court as early as 1631, and he was regularly reelected throughout the 1630s. Not much is known about Mary Brewster, but it's believed she was born around 1569, and she married Elder William Brewster in 1592. Because in an affidavit filed in Leiden, Holland, it's believed that she was 51 at the time of the voyage, and she sailed to Plymouth on board the Mayflower in 1620, along with her husband and also her 2 youngest children. And she was one of only 5 reported adult women aboard who survived that first winter, and one of just 4 still alive for the so-called first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1623 or 1621. There's been dispute. I believe the first Thanksgiving, if you want to call it that, took place in 1621, but I've looked at historical records who also reference 1623. Problem is, I don't think that they would have had a Thanksgiving after the Wessagusset Massacre, the Nemasket Raid, just my opinion. So, Brewster's son Jonathan joined the family in November 1621, arriving at Plymouth on the ship Fortune, before his daughters Patience and Fear arrived on another ship in July of 1623. But sadly, both daughters died later in 1634 when smallpox and influenza ravaged the region. Terrible years between 1633 and 1635, not only Plymouth, but also the Boston settlement. So the Mayflower was now moored in Provincetown Harbor, but before anyone was allowed to leave the ship, they wanted to hammer out a formal and binding agreement that we now know today as the Mayflower Compact, a primitive constitution of rights for men only. Knowing life without laws would prove catastrophic, colonist leaders created the Mayflower Compact to ensure a functioning social structure would prevail and preserve the right to worship as they wished. On November 11th, 1620, 41 adult male colonists, including 2 indentured servants, signed the Mayflower Compact, although it wasn't called that at the time. 9 men abstained and refused to sign it. Now, the Mayflower Compact was a short document which established that the colonists would remain loyal subjects to King James despite their need for self-governance. The colonists would create and enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the good of the colony and abide by those laws. The colonists would create one society and work together to further it. The colonists would live in accordance with the Christian faith. The Mayflower Compact was important because it was the first document to establish self-government in the New World, and it remained active until 1691, when Plymouth Colony became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Let's read it. In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, 54th, 1620. Bradford reflected on that first morning in America with wonder. But here, I cannot stay and make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. In the next 4 months, half of them would be dead. On November 6th, William Button had died while on board the Mayflower. Ellen Moore also died of illness on board the Mayflower. And the 5 who died while the Mayflower was anchored in Provincetown Harbor: William Button, November 16th or November 6th. Edward Thompson, December 4th. Jasper Moore, December 6th. Dorothy Bradford, December 7th. James Chilton, December 8th. And James Chilton was the only one who signed the Mayflower Compact, who died while the ship was moored in Provincetown Harbor. So they arrived and they sent ashore. They did not leave the ship the following day after they had moored, because it was the Sabbath, November 10th. But on Monday, November 11th, they made their first landing at Provincetown. Now they wanted to explore the land. So they had a 35-foot shallop in the hold of the Mayflower, but it had to be both reassembled and repaired, and that would take several days. So they used one of the 2 ships' boats, 21-footer instead, and they sent 16 men ashore. So they originally allowed the passengers to go ashore to wash their clothes, and that was a tradition in New England. It was a Monday, where Monday became washing day. And we know the exact place where they first landed due to a map that was in Mort's relation. And again, they briefly came ashore. It was written by Edward Winslow. He would become the 3rd governor of Plymouth Colony, but he showed a map where the first steps on land supposedly took place, which is probably more accurate than Plymouth Rock, but we'll get to that. And the landing place is commemorated with a plaque in a small park located in the middle of the rotary at the end of Commercial Street in Provincetown. And it's appropriately called Plymouth's First Landing Park. There's the first landing right there. Now, the Pilgrims immediately realized the sandy tip of the Cape was unsuitable for a permanent settlement, and they had to find a better location on the bay side of the shoreline. Bradford said, quote, "They fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element." They retired back to the ship before nightfall, but they brought aboard badly needed firewood. So they remained on board the Mayflower on Sunday, November 10th, to pray on the Sabbath. And when Monday the 13th came around, limited passengers were allowed to go ashore to bathe and wash their clothes. As I mentioned, that became a traditional wash day in New England. So now they're going to, after the first landing, there were actually 6 landings if you count that first day on Monday when they came aboard just to get firewood and to wash their clothes. But now they were going to send an overland exploratory expedition over the Cape Cod Peninsula. And they had seen this river off in the distance, which was the Pamit River. And of course, they were searching for fresh water. So there are basically 3 exploration expeditions that took place, November 15th through the 17th, November 27th through the 30th, and then December 6th through the 12th. But let's look at the first one, November 15th through the 17th. It was a Wednesday, and that's when they decided to send an overland exploratory party down the sandy dunes of Cape Cod, and it would be a 3-day expedition. They saw whales in the harbor and wished that they had whaling harpoons. Ashore, they saw birds and geese. Bradford says, the greatest store of fowl we ever saw. And Standish had the men in their light armor march in single file. They had marched about a mile when they saw 6 men or so, along with a dog, staring at them down the beach of Truro. This is not First Encounter Beach. So I like to call First Encounter Beach First Conflict Beach or Second Encounter Beach. We'll get to that in just a moment. So for a timeless moment, can you imagine how the natives felt looking at these pilgrims, these explorers? And for a while, they exchanged stares. And then they saw a dog, and they ran into the woods, and one of the natives whistled for the dog, and they scampered into the woods. Well, the pilgrims followed them, but they were bogged down by ankle-deep sand. They had breastplates on and very weak legs from their voyage. And they pursued them for about 7 miles before deciding to camp for the night for the first night of November 15th. They built a fire on the beach line, and they posted sentinels, and then they picked up their chase of the Indians at first light on November 16th. And at 10 a.m., they came into a valley, and there they saw their first American deer. And with their chainmail torn to pieces because they were going through shrubbery and brush, they now were desperately thirsty. And they had this crude alcoholic beverage with them to sustain them, aquavitae or something like that, awful. And then suddenly they came upon a small hill, and there they found a freshwater spring. And they quote, drunk our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drink in all our lives. That's supposedly a picture. It's known today as Pilgrim Spring. I visited that area just a few weeks ago. There's a marker there. So they were now going to billet for a second night, and they made camp at a place what is today called Pilgrim Pond. They lit another campfire as a signal to the Mayflower that they were safe. On the morning of Friday, December 17th, they found abandoned stubbled cornfields along with bones, and they stumbled upon what appeared to be a native grave. It would be odious unto the Indians if we ransacked their sepulchres. Then they came across evidence that they were not the first Europeans to come to the area. They found sawed planks and an iron kettle. There was no iron in the New World. And then they came upon the salty, tidal Pamit River. There they found remnants of a fort that might have been built by the explorer Martin Pring when 1603 captained an expedition to North America to assess its commercial potential. He explored, as I mentioned, areas of present-day Maine, New Hampshire, and Cape Cod. And then on a high seaside hill, they found mounds that they thought at first were graves, but they were unlike the grave that they had examined earlier. And in it, they found reed baskets filled with multicolored corn, which we call maize. And the Nauset tribe stored their seed corn and grain for winter months. And grain, if kept dry and cool, can be stored for years. So they were starving now, and they filled a large kettle full of this corn, and they made a commitment to compensate the owners at a later date. And this is the first act of American credit, in my opinion. Now, the area today is referred to as Corn Hill. And there's a marker there, nice park. They said, and sure it was God's good providence that we found this corn, for else we know not how we should have done. That was in Mort's relation, Edward Winslow. And there's a strange little marker that says Cornhill 1620 that I found just behind cottage number 10 at the Cornhill cottages. And I was just about to leave the area, and there it was, little tiny tablet. That's the actual area where they actually dug up the baskets. Cornhill, we call it. So by dusk that evening of the 17th, it was now raining, and they became lost in the woods, and William Bradford became entangled in an Indian animal snare. Finally, they met a landing party that was headed by John Carver and Christopher Jones at the shoreline, and they were taken back to the ship. Their first overland expedition was done. And then their second expedition, Monday, November 27th, they decided to send the reassembled shallop now, a larger boat with a sail, along with 16 men south along the inner cape to a place they would call Cold Harbor. This expedition now had 34 men and was led by Christopher Jones, 16 in a shallop, 18 in another boat joining them. That's Cold Harbor. So the winds were against them that night, and it blew them into an inlet, which is now Pilgrim Lake, and they spent the night there. And their shoes and clothing turned to ice. And Bradford would later recall, some of our people that are dead took the original of their death here. So here's where they got to go after more corn. So it was the morning of Tuesday, November 28th, and they were frostbitten. 6 inches of snow lay on the ground that had fallen overnight, and they decided to remain in Cold Harbor. Jones wanted to get back to the ship as they were in knee-deep snow and cold. So that evening, they camped by another fire, and they feasted on duck and geese. And the next morning, the 29th, they went looking for Cornhill, which was now obscured by the snow cover. They finally found it and located more stores of corn. But this time, they took it all. Christopher Jones, along with some invalid men who were freezing, took it back to the shallop, and he sailed it back to the Mayflower. Standish stayed behind with 18 men, and they struck up camp again. Now, Christopher Jones was to pick them up the following day, Thursday, November 30th. And that morning, Standish began to search for the indigenous peoples. They were nowhere to be found. Standish found another gravesite, and this time he decided to desecrate it. There they found the remains, what seemed to be of a European, with yellow hair, a sailor's sack, a knife, and a sewing needle. And next to him lay a child with a tiny wooden bow. Later that day, they found recently abandoned wigwams. They took articles at their pleasing and left nothing in return. So, looting and ransacking graves, corn stores, and villages would not endear them to the native inhabitants. They were picked up by the shallop that evening. They now understood that Pamet was not a proper place to settle. One of their pilots, Robert Coppin, vaguely recalled from a fishing expedition years earlier that there was a protected harbor with a river about 20 or so miles across the bay. He called it Thievish Harbor because the natives had stolen his company's harpoons. He's talking about Plymouth Harbor. On Wednesday, December 6th, they set out on their third expedition with John Clark and Robert Coffin leading. And Jones this time chose to remain behind on board the ship. But amongst the 16 men were William Bradford, Standish, Winslow, Howland, Carver, and Hopkins. And they would explore the harbors and the bay side of Cape Cod. You can see their route, the third expedition there. They go down the Cape. And here's where first encounter or first conflict happened. Right here, third landing, December 8th. So they sailed 15 miles down the coast, and now their coats were frozen by salt spray. They observed Indians hacking away on a beached whale carcass, and the natives then scrambled away when they glimpsed the shallop. So the Pilgrims set up camp and lit a fire, and they noticed a column of smoke about 4 miles away. And they'd heard strange noises throughout the night. So on the morning of the 7th, they continued to look for a settlement site as a landing party was dispatched from the shallop. They came across more grave sites and another abandoned village. By nightfall, they set up camp once again. But they were being watched. Now, Early on the morning of December 8th, following a long day of exploration and foraging, and an even longer night pierced by the hideous and great cry of what seemed to be a company of wolves or such like wild beasts, an exploring party of Englishmen was confronted by another great and strange cry, which they knew to be the same voices they heard in the night. This time, however, a returning scout exclaimed that the voices were not beasts at all, but men, Indians, Indians. His warning arrived only moments before a flurry of arrows flew through the barricaded Mayflower shore party, and 4 pilgrims returned musket fire, though none found its target. They disengaged and hastily returned to their shallop. Now the 4th landing. They scouted Cape Cod for a settlement site, but they found none, and then they headed for Plymouth Harbor and a deserted Patuxet village. But as they rounded Saquesh Head, which is the Gurnet there on the map there, they encountered a fierce snowstorm near Clark's Island, and the wind snapped the shallop's mast and broke their rudder. They were adrift now, and somehow John Clark, who they brought aboard the boat, he managed to get the boat to shore, and that's where they repaired it. And they spent 2 nights on Clark's Island, named after John Clark, in the freezing sleet, and they prayed Psalms 61 and 100 at a place called Pulpit Rock, or Election Rock, because that's when they started to determine who was going to lead the colony. And then they returned to the ship. Now that's Pulpit Rock on Clark's Island, and I had an opportunity to kayak out there and actually pray Psalm 100 at the foot of what I call the true Plymouth Rock. So the 5th landing was now at Plymouth. It took 5 attempts before they found Plymouth. And now they're in Patuxet, a deserted Indian village. So on December 11th, 1620, the Pilgrim men landed on Plymouth Harbor Beach, and they secured the boat to a glacial rock in the harbor. Now, Plymouth Rock was a 200-ton boulder of Dedham granite, the only Dedham granite in the area. And since then, it's been cut in half, glued back together, bombed, dropped twice, and trimmed to fit its present-day portico. Legend has it that Mary Chilton was the first European female to step foot on New England soil on Plymouth Rock. Personally, I believe the first part of the story, that she was the first to step on land, but I don't believe the part about Plymouth Rock. In my estimation, the true Plymouth Rock, if there is one at all, is on Clark's Island, Pulpit, or Election Rock. So once the Pilgrim had come ashore and they established the land that they would build on, they made plans for their settlement. And they had decided that the houses would be close together and near the fields that were already cleared by the Patuxet. Now, on top of the highest hill, they would erect the fort. They built but a violent storm delayed the building, and it wasn't until January 2nd that trees were actually felled and construction began. In less than a week, the common house was erected, and after that, families started to build their own homes. It would take several months for the Pilgrims to build houses. And they'd shuttle back and forth from the Mayflower for the next 3 months until the women and children were allowed to disembark in early March 1621. And now they were threadbare and starving. They had not that winter been relatively mild, even though this occurred in the period, I hate this term, the Little Ice Age. There's so many perturbations during the Little Ice Age, the Maunder Minimum and the Dalton Minimum, but another story. Anyways, that allowed them, because it was relatively mild, to actually construct housing. Otherwise, none of them would have survived. So they were grossly unprepared now. Their supplies had dwindled. They had very little experience hunting or fishing, but they did kill a few fowl to survive. And now, John Carver, it was decided at Election Rock that he was now their governor. But unfortunately, he would die while attending to a field in April, one of those strange hot April days, and he would be succeeded by William Bradford as the leaders of the colony. It sounds like Carver had a stroke. Bradford's now in charge. So Governor Carver, before his death, though, had rationed 5 kernels of maize to each person once each day. And they found mussels, which are shellfish. They consumed them, and then they were struck by shellfish poisoning. And come to think, they didn't even have a single fishing line to go after the massive amounts of fish that were just offshore. When spring arrived, only 57 of 102 pilgrims and their crew had survived. 17 were children, and now hunger and malnutrition led to disease, namely vitamin deficiencies like scurvy, pneumonia, and eventually death. 18 pilgrims died in January, 17 in February, 13 in March. And the Pilgrims buried their dead at night in unmarked graves because they did not want the Native Americans to know how many had died, and fearing attack, they would actually prop up the dying against trees with muskets in hand to trick the natives into thinking that they were sentinels. How arrogant and naive is that? So now the Pilgrims are buried, and their descendants will desecrate the Pilgrims' graves. After a storm of 1735, a torrent pouring down Middle Street made a ravine in Coles Hill and washed many human remains down into the harbor. The Pilgrims did not settle at where modern-day Plymouth Plantation is. They settled at Coles Hill. That was where they first built the houses. Anyways, in 1809, a skull with especially fine teeth was exposed. And in 1855, these graves were exposed in laying the public conduit on Coles Hill, where today there's a sarcophagus in their commemoration. That's it right there. In one grave lay two skeletons pronounced by surgeons to be male and female. And the man had a particularly noble forehead, and it was fondly surmised that here were the remains of John and Catherine Carver. And they found a new grave on Old Burial Hill, but the other relics with barbaric taste were actually placed in the top of the stone canopy over Plymouth Rock. And in 1879, during some work on the southeast side of the hill, many more bones were unearthed, and some, with questionable taste, were carried away by the spectators in remembrance of their renowned sires. That's the portico, the original portico of Plymouth Rock. The Lost Plymouth Children. Jasper Moore, age 7th, on board, December 6th, 1620, on the Mayflower. Solomon Prower, age 14 to 17, in December. Eleanor Ellen Moore, age 8, in Plymouth, January of 1621, from pneumonia. Mary Moore, age 4, winter of 1620. Joseph Mullins, age 14, February 22nd through the 28th. The son of Thomas Tinker died, and both sons of John Turner. Now, on March 17th, they planted English herbs, vegetables, peas, wheat, and barley. But the wheat the Pilgrims had brought with them would not grow in the rocky, acidic New England soil and sandy soil. So they harvested reeds from the marshes now, and they thatched their roofs, and they scouted for natives. Little did they know the natives were watching them at all times. So although the military men and Commander Miles Standish had been shot at by Indians on Cape Cod, the Pilgrims had yet to meet the terrible savages. Let's talk about Miles Standish. Born 1584, died 1656. The men of Plymouth Colony continued to re-elect Miles Standish as commander of military affairs for the remainder of his life. And Bradford and Standish were frequently preoccupied with the complex task of reacting to threats against both the Pilgrims and the Pokanoket tribes, such as the Massasoit and the Narragansett. There's a complex weave of rivalries here and setting different tribes up against different tribes. But a defining characteristic of Standish's military leadership was his proclivity for preemptive action, which resulted in at least 2 attacks or small skirmishes on different groups of Native Americans, namely the Nemasket Raid, followed by the Wessagusset Massacre. Now, the terrible savages had been watching the Pilgrims from the safety of surrounding woods, and they were learning everything they could about these new settlers who were encroaching on their land, the squatters. And their previous experience with white men had made them cautious and suspicious, and they brought diseases with them. But natives were eager to trade, as they had a fascination with European trinkets, weapons, kettles, pork, and alcohol. Samoset was the first Native American to make contact with the Pilgrims. And on March 16, 1621, the settlers were more than surprised when Samoset went into Plymouth and greeted them in English, which he had learned from English traders in Maine. And that's where Samoset was from, which was part of the Wampanoag tribe, the Wampanoag Federation. But he was a Sagamore, which is a subordinate chief of his tribe, and he was visiting Chief Massasoit. And he had learned his broken English from the English fishermen that came to fish off of his Monhegan Island. So, with a hand raised in friendship, Samoset greeted the Pilgrims in English, saying, "Welcome, Englishmen." And then he asked if they had any beer. True story. The Pilgrims were astonished, and although he was friendly and dignified and he spoke their language, they greeted him cautiously. And he spent that night with the Pilgrims, and at first they attempted to sequester him on the Mayflower, but the sea was too rough, so he spent the night inside the fortification. Samoset now was Massasoit's temporary ambassador, and he had come into Plymouth after observing the Pilgrims. Now, he and Squanto had been surprised to return to their abandoned village after the winter and find that there were Englishmen living there. So Samoset departed the following morning, and he promised that he would return in a week with the local leader, the Sachem Massasoit. And this time, he also brought Squanto, who spoke much better English than Samoset. So for the next few days, Squanto acted as an interpreter while Governor Carver and Massasoit worked out a peace treaty that would last more than 50 years. So at this point, I think that Samoset becomes aware of Squanto's duplicity, and we'll go over that. Now, after March 22nd, 1621, just 6 days after he first walked into the village, Samoset disappears from the records and nothing more has been learned about him. My theory is that he returned to Maine, feeling unwanted by Massasoit, due to a deep-seated distrust of Squanto. Squanto was going to be the lead interpreter. Now, William Bradford loved Squanto as if he were his own son, even though he and Massasoit were suspicious of his motives. Squanto, speaking nearly fluent English, had a tremendous advantage over everyone, as he could communicate to both tribes and alter their words if he felt that it could put him in a better position politically, as he dreamed of being one day the sachem of the Wampanoag Federation. No, Asamaquin, we call him Massasoit, lived from circa 1581 to around the year 1661. So roughly he's 39 to 40. And he was the sachem of the Pokanoket and the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Now, the term Massasoit means great sachem, and he was born in the Pokanoket village of Mount Hope, today's Warren and Bristol, Rhode Island. And some people say he was about 35 when the Pilgrims arrived. I think he was nearing 40. But Samoset had introduced himself to the Pilgrims as the envoy of Massasoit, whom he called the greatest commander of the country, and he arranged Massasoit's meeting with the colonists. And Massasoit negotiated a treaty guaranteeing the English their security in exchange for their alliance against the Narragansett. Again, the Narragansett had not been decimated by the Great Dying. His tribe, actually Massasoit's tribe, was decimated by two significant outbreaks of disease brought by the explorers during the previous 6 years. Typhus epidemic, and the Great Dying. Now, the Great Dying had wiped out 80% of Massasoit's warrior force, and now the Narragansett chief, Canonicus, whose people had not been affected by the plague because they used social distancing, they now demanded tribute in return for protection, which was actually subjugation from smaller tribes in the area, including Massasoit, the Wampanoag, the Nausets, the Patuxet, the Massachusetts, etc. So Massasoit saw that an alliance with the Pilgrims could strengthen his defenses against the Narragansett. And they were already allied with the Massachusetts to the north and the Nauset to the east. So you can see here how closely the Wampanoag here and the Nauset, Massachusetts. And here's Mount Hope right on the border of Narragansett territory. So after the collapse of the beaver trade, Massasoit sold off tribal lands for a mere pittance. But Massasoit prevented the failure of the Plymouth Colony and the almost certain starvation that the Pilgrims faced during the earliest years of the colony's establishment. Moreover, Massasoit forged critical political and personal ties with the colonial leaders, which grew out of a negotiated peace treaty on March 22nd, 1621, which stood for 50 years until his death. And the treaty was considered sacred by Massasoit. Now, Massasoit sold lands which the English insisted on having, and he was humane and honest. He never violated his word, and he constantly endeavored to imbue his people with a love of peace. So after the agreement, Massasoit returned to his home of Mount Hope, but he left Squanto behind, his savvy liaison, interpreter, and spy, and he remained in Patuxet, his former village, now appropriated by the Pilgrims. It was his original home before he had been sold into slavery. And in the months that he spent with the Pilgrims, Squanto taught them how to survive in the new place by pointing out poisonous plants and showing them how to use other plants as medicine. And he helped them get through their first full summer there by teaching them the native method of catching fish, eels, shellfish, deer, fowl, and other wildlife for food. And he explained how to get sap from the maple trees, trap animals, and dozens of other skills needed for their survival. Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to maximize land production with strategic planting of the Three Sisters. That is, drop herring into dug rows and cover them with soil. Then push the corn kernels into the topsoil. Then plant beans next to the corn so they could climb the stalks. And finally, plant pumpkin and squash between the rows. He showed the squirrel nests and skunk hideouts, and that following the bear paths would lead them to blueberry patches. He told them that the deer were active at sunrise and sundown, and he showed the Pilgrims the valleys where the deer tended to congregate in the winter. Squanto took the children to the meadows. They picked wild strawberries. He taught them how to dig up the native Jerusalem artichokes. And in midsummer, they would go to the cranberry bogs and gooseberry patches. And through the fall, they'd gather chestnuts, hickory nuts, walnuts, and hazelnuts. And then he paddled the boys out into the harbor in dugout canoes and set lobster pots made of resin and sinew. When the crops were growing, Squanto took the men into the forests where the turkeys dwelled, and he pointed out the nuts, seeds, and insects that the birds ate. Turkey was a term used by Pilgrims to mean any kind of wild fowl. And then, on April 5th, 1621, the citizens of Pilgrim, hungry, thin, and in threadbare clothes, watched the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth to return to the homeland of England. And not one Pilgrim asked to return. And the Mayflower arrived in just 1 month as opposed to the 2 that it took to come over, arriving in England on May 6th, 1621. Let's look at Pokanoket tribal order. There was a Sachem or chief, Massasoit, the Sagamore or subordinate chief, Quartakina, for instance, his brother. And then beneath the Sachem was a class of principal men called Atashkoag in Algonquian, which consisted of shamans called powwows or powers by the English, who mediated between the people and the god of healing, Hobomoko, called the Hobomok or the Hobomoki by the English. And the Panisok, or the Panis, they were both advisors and administrative delegates of the Sachem, who collected the annual tribute, the tax to the Sachem, and he led warriors into battle and advised on the distribution or the sale of land. Now, females could attain all of these principal roles, squaw Sachem you hear about in history, except for the Panis. That was reserved from that. So, throughout the season, others from Massasoit's family and the surrounding Wampanoag tribes would come into Plymouth and teach the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World. One of them, named Hobomok, would later become a praying Indian and a loyal emissary for the Puritans for the rest of his life. But he and Squanto quickly became rivals, and they were both prone to twisting the truth. Hobomok began living with the Pilgrims in the summer of 1621, their first summer. He was a Pokanoket Panis and a subordinate to Massasoit, whom he worshipped. He loved Massasoit. And on August 13th, he came into Plymouth Plantation, startled. He claimed that Squanto, whom he was with at the time, was kidnapped by a Pocasset Sagamore named Corbitant. He claimed that Corbitant held a knife to him, but somehow he managed to escape. And a punitive party led by Miles Standish was then sent to Nemasket, modern-day Middleborough, to free their emissary Squanto. Squanto was allegedly captured by Corbitant while gathering intelligence on behalf of Governor Bradford at the village of Nemasket, again present-day Middleborough. Corbitant, this is according to Hobomok, was thought to be plotting against Massasoit and the Pokanoket. Miles Standish, on Hobomok's word, then led a 10-man team from Plymouth to rescue Squanto, or, if he had been killed, to avenge him. So Standish's men descended on Nemasket at midnight. They fired their muskets all around and kicked down several huts in search of Squanto, and he terrified the natives, especially the women and children, and they claimed that Corbitant had already left the village. So 3 natives were wounded now, 2 seriously by musket fire, but where was Squanto? Hobomok called out to him, and suddenly Squanto came out of the woods unharmed, escorted by some Patuxet tribesmen. And I've thought about this. Was this a setup? Or were the tribesmen, when they heard the muskets, they knew the game was up? That's probably what they did. They were terrified, and they didn't have muskets at that point in time, and they turned over Squanto. So, although Standish had failed to capture Corbitant, the raid had the desired effect, because on September 13th, 1621, 9 sachems, including Corbitant, came to Plymouth to sign a treaty of loyalty to King James, and conflict for the time being was averted. Now, although Squanto worked at alliances, he was ended up distrusted by both the English and the Wampanoag, including the Nauset, as he sought to set the Massasoit against the Pokanoket and vice versa, always wriggling out of trouble at the last second. And later, Massasoit would even order his arrest. And in 1622, on his way back from a meeting to repair damaged relations between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, and also to secure more food and supplies, Squanto's nose suddenly began to bleed, and he became sick with a fever. And he died in Chatham, with historians and Bradford attributing his death to, quote, an Indian fever. And Governor William Bradford declared Squanto's death a great loss. Bradford said, "In this place Squanto fell sick of Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians take as a symptom of death, and within a few days died there, desiring the governor to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and bequeathed sundry of his things to English friends, as remembrances of his love, of whom they had a great loss." So here's the question. How could Squanto have succumbed to an illness after he had been exposed to thousands of Europeans on several ships and on the streets of London and Madrid, and continual exposure to European traders? Was it a stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage? Or was he poisoned by the Nauset, who really disliked them? Was his assassination actually sponsored by Massasoit, who had lost all trust in Squanto when he tried to overthrow him? But we would not be here if it were not for Squanto. Thank you to Squanto. What your kid did to mine. Massasoit and Edward Winslow became close friends. And when Massasoit fell ill, Winslow rushed to his side and provided a concoction that may or may not have helped Massasoit recover. He also cooked him a chicken broth as well. So, at Massasoit's request, he scraped the mouths of villagers who were ravaged by influenza. And Massasoit would have rolled in his grave if he knew what Winslow's son Josiah, who would become the future governor, would do to his 2 sons, Websutta, anglicized as Alexander, he was poisoned at Winslow's home, or Metacom, King Philip, whom Josiah Winslow had beheaded. Barbarous. Now the Wessagusset Massacre. On March 26th, after receiving reports of a planned attack on Thomas Weston's new ill-fated and ill-prepared colony north of Plymouth, Miles Standish set out with 9 men, including Hobomok, on a preemptive strike to the settlement of Wessagusset, which today is Weymouth. By 1623, the Massachusetts and Neponset natives were becoming increasingly irritated with the new settlers, especially at Wessagusset. They were disrespectful. They would steal their corn and their beans. They didn't have the skills to survive. They were lazy. And it was rumored by Hobomok that they intended to band together these Indian tribes to wipe out the Wessagusset settlers and also attack the Plymouth settlers, get rid of colonizers once and for all. And Standish also wanted to settle a score with one of the powwows there at Wessagusset, known as Watuamat. Now, one of his strongest warriors in the region, Watuamat, Standish felt that Watuamat had affronted him during an encounter early that year by waving his knife in front of Standish. Now, Phineas Pratt, he was a member of that ill-fated Wessagusset colony, and he managed to run away. because the men were starving and freezing to death, and he made his way to Plymouth. He was being followed by a native scout, so he started walking backwards to elude him, but then he got lost. Anyways, when he made it to Plymouth, he had confirmed what Hobomok had said, that there was an uprising. So Standish had a ghoulish plan: kill them all. So Standish arrived at Wessagusset, and he pretended to be cordial, and there under the guise of trade. Now Patuxet, a Panice, another tall and muscled warrior, Wittewamet's friend, insulted Standish's small stature. Standish was known as Captain Shrimp behind his back, and he waved his knife in front of Standish again. Standish, though, lured them and Wittewamet's young brother and some native females into a hut for trading and a meal of pork, which the natives considered to be a delicacy. But when Patuxet looked into Standish's eyes, he knew that he was up to no good. So, while they were eating this delicious pork and being distracted, Standish took their knives and he gruesomely stabbed the three men over and over again. There was blood everywhere. And then he took the women hostage and killed a fourth native man in the village. And then Standish, and this is so ghoulish, he had the bodies drawn and quartered, and then he cut off the head of Wittewamet. He wrapped it in a white linen and brought it back to the plantation to a hero's welcome. The head was then placed on a pike at the fork as a warning to all other natives. And in fact, that blood-soaked linen was flown as a banner at William Bradford's second wedding to Anne Southworth that August. Then came the bountiful harvest. In 1621, the harvest was beyond any that the Pilgrims could have imagined. Larders and pantries were full of corn, pumpkins, dried venison, salmon, herring, cod, and ducks, while racks of wild berries lie drying in the sun. Now, those who had survived that devastating first winter and had managed to settle Plymouth with homes and crops, they were now ready to celebrate their good fortune. The Pilgrims didn't call this harvest festival a Thanksgiving, although they did give thanks to God. To them, a day of Thanksgiving was a purely religious observance. The feast was more of a traditional English harvest festival. And the Native Americans had their traditional green corn ceremony or celebration, where they would dance and sing for 3 days. So the coming together of these two cultures to share their harvest traditions and celebrate a mutually bountiful year in the late autumn of 1621 is considered by many to be the first Thanksgiving. The native women sat together with the native men to eat. The Pilgrim women, however, stood quietly behind the table and waited until after their men had eaten, since that was their custom. Now, the new governor, William Bradford, asked Squanto to invite Massasoit and his entourage to a feast, acknowledging that they would not have made it through the year without the help of the natives. Another recorded religious day of Thanksgiving, as I mentioned previously, was apparently held in 1623. Again, I'm skeptical because of what happened at Wessagusset. Here are the primary sources for the first Thanksgiving at Plymouth. There are two and only two primary sources. One is Edward Winslow writing in Mort's Relation, and William Bradford writing in Of Plymouth Plantation. Edward Winslow, Mort's Relation. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after which we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside served the company almost a week, at which time amongst other recreations we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing, about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was a great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since the harvest, Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not feigned, but true reports. There were 53 pilgrims at the first Thanksgiving. 4 married women, including Eleanor Billington, Mary Brewster, Elizabeth Hopkins, and Susanna White Winslow. There were 5 adolescent girls, including Mary Chilton, age 14, and Priscilla Mullins, age 19, and Elizabeth Tilley, Constance Hopkins, and Dorothy the Carver's unnamed maidservant, perhaps 18 or 19. There were 9 adolescent boys, including the 2 Billingtons, 13 young children, and 22 men. Massasoit arrived on the first day of the feast with his family, 90 of them. And momentarily shocked by the expanded size of the festival, the women quickly fried more cornbread, they cooked more vegetables, and stuffed more turkeys with bread and cranberries. They didn't have butter. Seeing that the pilgrims were not prepared to feed a gathering of people that large for 3 days, Massasoit gave orders to his men within the first hour of his arrival to go home and bring back more food. Thus it happened that the Indians supplied the majority of the food: 5 deer, many wild turkeys, fish, beans, squash, corn soup, cornbread, and berries. The supply of flour that the pilgrims brought over with them in the New World had long been diminished, so there was no bread or pastries of any kind except cornbread. However, they ate boiled pumpkin, and there was also no milk, butter, or cider, no domestic cattle for dairy products, no chickens, and the newly discovered potato was still considered by many Europeans at that time to be poisonous, tuba. But the feast included fish, berries, watercress, lobster, dried fruit, clams, venison, and plums. For 3 days, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans feasted, they sang, they danced, they played games, shot guns, and fired arrows. Now, this Thanksgiving feast would not be repeated the following year, and many years would pass before it was repeated. In June of 1676, at the conclusion of King Philip's War, a gruesome war, celebrating the end of the war, it would be celebrated in October of 1777, when the 13 colonies joined in Thanksgiving for the victory over the British at Saratoga. And George Washington proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving in 1789, but there was discord among the colonies, many feeling the hardships of a few pilgrims did not warrant a national holiday. In fact, Thomas Jefferson actually opposed the idea of having Thanksgiving. Eventually, the religious day of Thanksgiving and the Harvest Festival evolved into one single event, a yearly Thanksgiving proclaimed by individual governors for a Thursday in November. And the custom of an annual Thanksgiving celebrating abundance and family spread across America. So before it became a national holiday, Sarah Josepha Hale lobbied for it, writing to politicians, to magazines, and finally, after 40 years of campaigning for a national holiday of Thanksgiving, that's when President Lincoln issued a proclamation in 1863 proclaiming the last Thursday in November as the Thanksgiving holiday. But the unified date changed to the 4th Thursday, not always the final in November, and this was legislated by President Roosevelt. What about the first Thanksgiving? The claim of where the first Thanksgiving was held in the United States is up for debate. Author and teacher Robin Goya, along with Michael Gannon of the University of Florida, have argued that the earliest attested Thanksgiving celebration in what is now the United States was celebrated by the Spanish on September 8, 1565, in what is now the settlement of St. Augustine, Florida. Others say that they celebrated it in Jamestown as early as 1607, but we don't know. But what we do know is one of the oldest spice mixes in the country, Bell's, dates back to 1867 when William F. Bell of Newton, Massachusetts, created the blend from an old family recipe. Since then, nothing has changed. Come to think of it, neither has the box. salt-free, an all-natural blend of rosemary, oregano, sage, ginger, marjoram, thyme, and pepper with no added preservatives, additives, or artificial ingredients. Combined, bells, the aroma is pure Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving tradition since 1924, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and the annual Thanksgiving Day football games. The first Thanksgiving morning football game was played in 1882 at Morton Field in Wellesley, Mass, named West Needham at the time, and it's the oldest public high school rivalry. And of course, we have the Detroit Lions, who have played on Thanksgiving, every Thanksgiving since 1934, and they've virtually lost almost every single game. Poor Lions. There's been pardoning the turkey at the White House as a Thanksgiving tradition, Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, the turducken, and of course, Black Friday. So from this turkey to you, happy Thanksgiving. I'm John Horrigan. This has been the Pilgrims, 400 years after. Take care. Today's presentation is being brought to you by the Wellesley Council on Aging. Hello. And to all of you watching on Wellesley Public Media, thank you so much for joining me.